Welcome, students of Paul. It's good to have you with me again. And today we're going to be talking about getting at the person of Paul as influenced by his many first century contexts. So we've been talking in the class about the different contexts that influenced Paul, his Hellenistic culture, his Greek language, the Roman Empire, and so on. And basically, this set of slides is talking about how, in studying any historical figure, including Paul, we need to talk about the many overlapping contexts of identity. By the way, this is not just something in the first century. This is something that applies to us as well, as we will see. So overlapping circles of identity. I'd like you to, after we've explained this, to stop the video and to take a moment and think about and jot down some of the overlapping circles of identity in which you live. So for instance, I am I'm an Anglophone Montrealer, a Quebecer, but was born in Saskatchewan of European background, Northern European background. So what I'd like you to do is write down things, whatever you want, really, but some things that are the overlapping circles of identity in which you find yourself. So that can be all kinds of things, and I've listed all kinds of things here. The point of it, I just want to say, is not to pigeonhole you in any way, but to point out how we all live within multiple belongings and identifications that are both internally arrived at and externally imposed upon us. And that's the whole point. So this is not to define you in any way, but I want you to write down take a moment, write down a few things. Okay, and then come back when you're done. Great. All right, so if you've done that, now the point is you can throw away that list, but what I want you to do is to think about Paul. From what you know, list on paper 3 or 4 of the overlapping circles of identity in which he may have lived and worked. And this is what a piece of paper I want you to hold on to so that we can talk about later. Think about some of the overlapping circles of identity within which Paul may have lived and worked in the first century. And then I want you to do something else, which is to take a look at that slide that I took on the right-hand side. I think this is from a cathedral in Nottingham, England. And there I put here, representations of Paul throughout history tend to present Paul in a very definite way. And this is a fairly typical European presentation of Paul. Be prepared to come to our meeting listing 3 or 4 of the characteristics usually associated in history's reception and portrayal of Paul. So take a look and deconstruct that image that you see on the right. Stop the slide, deconstruct the image, and write down some of what you see as history's usual presentation of Paul from this. And when you're done that, start the video back up and we'll see you next slide. All right, Paul. Paul was a Torah following, meaning a pious first century Jew, Romanized, if not Roman, educated, urban, ascetic, and single Jewish male. There's a lot of things in there, a lot of adjectives. Torah following, Romanized, educated, urban, ascetic, single Jewish male who spoke, thought, and argued in Greek. So those are some of Paul's overlapping circles of identity. This, by the way, this is near Pompeii. These Roman era columns that you see on the right-hand side are from Pompeii, and so they date from the exact same time as Paul, almost exactly. Throughout most of history, Christian commentators have called Paul the first Christian. Now, Paul was many things, and we just talked about some of them, but he was definitely not this. Now, why wasn't he a Christian? The main and first reason should be that Christianity didn't exist yet as a religion, so he could not have been something that did not yet exist. Paul's life and death were very much affected by his Jewish faith, his Greek culture, and his Roman political world. So literacy in the first century Roman world. Paul was literate in a society where the vast majority of people were not. So one of the circles of identity for Paul is that he was literate. And that makes a huge difference. Paul was educated. He was literate in a society where the vast majority of people were not literate. Literacy meant being trained in rhetoric. No, so literacy then was different from literacy now. Literacy then meant being trained in rhetoric or in argumentative speech. Now, this will be important in understanding Paul's letters. When we look at Paul's letters later, he followed a very specific pattern of writing and argumentation that he learned in school. There were degrees of literacy in the first century, different levels of reading, and many who could read could not write. So literacy didn't mean the same thing to all people in the first century. Still doesn't, by the way, but it didn't then either. Enslaved persons could be more literate than their masters. So slavery, enslaved status in the first century did not mean the same thing that it came to mean later on, especially in the Americas. In the first century, it was quite possible that an enslaved person might have been better educated than their masters, than those who enslaved them, and they were in some cases then used as scribes by those others. Jesus' followers in Paul's assemblies would have received his letters orally. So that's an important thing. When we think about the New Testament, or we think about Paul's letters, we think about reading them individually. We think about sitting quietly with a document on a screen or in a book and reading it one-to-one. But Jesus' followers that Paul was addressing almost always received it through the ears. That is, somebody spoke it and enunciated it and projected it in a certain dramatic way, and they received it that way. Notice the text here, from Galatians, Paul's letter to the Galatians, chapter 6, verse 11. See what large letters I make when I am writing in my own hand, writes Paul. Now, there's a lot of things. So think about, what does that mean? If Paul writes, see what large letters I make when I'm writing in my own hand, we can deduce, like detectives, some things from that. Firstly, why does he make large letters? Maybe he's not comfortable writing all the time. If he says, when I'm writing in my own hand, what does that say about the rest of Galatians? Right. It means Paul didn't write the rest of Galatians. At least he didn't write it down. He may have spoke it, but he did not write it because he only wrote this one sentence. Now, in a first century letter where people did not sign their names at the end of letters, what else does this mean? It means this is how first century authors signed. They wrote one sentence in their own hand if they could to show that that was from them. So why would you write something in your own hand? To prove that it's from you? Only if other people are sometimes writing things and saying that it's from them. All right, so let's take a look at the next slide. Enslavement and freedom in the first century Roman world. This slide on the left is a particularly important image to me. I took this photo in modern day Philippi, which is really just a set of ruins near Kavala in northern Greece. And the little plaque beside this, it's not quite a statue, but this piece doesn't say what it is. But I looked at it a long time because it's done in such a naturalistic way when so many of the other statues and frescoes there are done in a very formal, stylized, and not very naturalistic way. And this looks so naturalistic. And I think it's an enslaved person. And I think that that they're holding something in their hands that relates to the image of the person who was their master, who had enslaved them, and perhaps had set them free. So take note of that. And when we are talking in live time, we'll talk more about that. Remind me, and we'll talk more about this particular image. But it's a fascinating image of a slave with likely an enslaved person, likely with his manumission papers. And manumission means papers that partially allowed you in the first century to gain your freedom. So text again from Paul. This is from the book of Philemon or Philemon, depending on how you pronounce it. Both ways are fine. Paul writes, I am appealing to you for my child Onesimus, whose father I have become during my imprisonment. Formerly he was useless to you. That's a pun, by the way, because the word Onesimus actually means useful. So formerly he was not Onesimus to you, but now he is indeed Onesimus, or useful, both to you and to me. I am sending him, that is my own heart, back to you. There you start to see some of the rhetoric we'll talk about later. I wanted to keep him with me so that he might be of service to me in your place during my imprisonment for the gospel. That's interesting. But I preferred to do nothing without your consent, in order that your good deed, Philemon, might be voluntary and not something forced. Now, there's all kinds of rhetoric going through here that we're going to talk about specifically later on. Perhaps, Paul writes, this is the reason Onesimus was separated from you for a while, so that you might have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but as more than a slave. Now notice he doesn't say not as a slave. some interesting stuff going on here. No longer as a slave, but as more than a slave, a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. All kinds of complicated things here about enslavement and Paul. So if you consider me your partner, welcome him as you would welcome me. If he has wronged you in any way or owes you anything, charge that to my account, writes Paul. We're going to talk more about Philemon and about Onesimus later on, but I mostly wanted here just to flag up that the state of enslavement in the first century Roman world was incredibly important to the running of the empire and to the lives of the millions of people. The number of enslaved persons in the Roman Empire was absolutely huge. Apparently in the capital, in Rome, it was some incredible percentage, a quarter, a third of the people. And some of the very largest households had hundreds and hundreds of enslaved persons whom they employed. So enslavement in the first century and amongst the early Jesus movement was important just because it was such an important part of that world. All right, let's keep going. That's part of the context of Paul, so that he was not an enslaved person in a world where there were many, many enslaved persons. So he was literate, he was free or not enslaved. And let's look at what it's next, embedded cultural contexts. Instead of thinking of only a Jewish world and a Greek world and a Roman world, think of embedded simultaneous cultures, similar to what we live in. So a person could easily be, many of my friends in Montreal are Italian, bilingual Montrealers, Italian background, bilingual Montrealers. So they speak Italian, they speak French, they speak English, and they consider themselves Montrealers and Quebecers and are. A first century Jew, especially one like Paul, lived in a Jewish context within a Hellenized society that was part of the Roman Empire, politically, ideologically, religiously, and historically. So there's lots going on for Paul, but these overlapping identities tend to have to do with Greek culture, Jewish faith for Paul, Greek culture, Jewish faith, and Roman domination or political hegemony. All right, major influences in Paul's world. So this is just another way of saying the same thing. Paul, I've put this little chart here with Paul at the center, and then around him, the Jewish practice, which focused on the temple. One of the things we forget about Paul is that the temple still stood when Paul was alive and doing his work. There was a temple in Jerusalem, and Paul's emphasis, even though he was a diaspora Jew, which means he did not live in Palestine, in Judea. He lived out in the broader geographic Roman world. The temple was still the focus of Jewish life, even for diaspora Jews. So the temple and synagogues, local teaching places where Jewish community gathered. So you've got Paul, he lives within this pious Jewish framework of being a pious Jew. He lives also within a Hellenistic culture, a Greek influenced culture, Greek language, Greek education, Greek worldview. The Romans in the Eastern Mediterranean were very much Hellenized as well. So even though it was a Roman Empire, it was still very much a Greek mindset. And that was all within the Roman Empire, which politically and in other ways dominated the world in which Paul lived and worked. So Paul has all of these identities at once. So it's wrong. What I want to point out is that it's wrong to say, oh, Paul was a Jew as opposed to a Roman. No, he was a Roman Jew. Or Paul was a Jew as opposed to a Greek. Well, even though Paul makes this distinction between Jews and Greeks sometimes, he was in fact himself a Hellenized Jew, a diaspora Jew. So he very much had overlapping multiple identities, and that's not so unusual, and it's true of us still now. Paul's identity from multiple influences: an urban Jew from the diaspora, culturally Greek but faithful to Judaism. Pax Romana, the greatest freedom to travel for centuries before or after. There's a quote by Wayne Meeks at one point that says that during the early Roman Empire, the first century that Paul was in, travel was easiest and safest if you were a freed person. Travel was easiest for any time in that area of the world until the 17th or 18th century. So amazingly, for a millennium and a half, it would not be, again, the conditions for easy travel. And it's interesting now, of course, during a pandemic that travel has become more difficult again. Lower right-hand corner, it was an age of sects and messiahs, including within Jewish Hellenism. People and their gods go together. So there was lots going on, lots of different religious groups. Within Judaism, there were Palestinian Judaism, there were various messianic movements, although not everyone and not all the time, but there were some. And it was an apocalyptic feeling age. On the lower left corner, universal Hellenistic or Greek culture, a world organized by Greek language, thought, and polis. Polis means city. And what that means is that cities tended to be, when they were built, were built according to a pattern initiated by Alexander the Great centuries before, but a Greek pattern with a certain kind of an order to them, with a temple at the center and an agora or a market and so on. All right, so Paul's identity came from multiple influences. So what's missing? I have not got it all here. We've talked about Paul's religion, his literacy, his political context, and his status as a non-enslaved person. Note what parts of Paul's identity we haven't examined in detail so far in these slides. So again, this is the last thing I'd like you to note down on your papers. Helpful new perspectives on Paul emerge when we examine this first century Jew through other lenses, through Paul's gender. So what did it mean to identify as male in the first century? That's really quite important, because maleness and femaleness in the first century did not mean quite the same things then as they do now. Paul talks from a heavily urban perspective. It's interesting that when Jesus, according to the Gospels, when Jesus told his stories, he used very much rural, small town examples. Look at the birds of the air, look at the flowers in the field, the sower went out with seed, a farmer did this. Paul never uses the example of a farmer. He probably doesn't know what farmers do, or barely. I'm sure he did, but Paul uses the examples of people who are running races, of soldiers or warriors, of gladiators. He uses examples from city life, urban life. Paul was unmarried, which was perhaps unusual for somebody his age in his situation. Paul was unmarried, and he was an ascetic, which we'll talk more about later, but he had a definite proclivity to avoid marriage, to avoid sexual relations and intimate relations with someone else. And for him, that was a part of his particular take on religion, on his apocalyptic Judaism. And finally, Paul's health. Was Paul healthy or not? There are debates about that. So all of these other lenses we haven't really talked about, but they are also part of Paul's overlapping identity, and they help us understand his letters. All of these different things: his Greek language, his Roman political context, his Jewish faith, his freedom, his maleness, his urban background. All of these things help us understand his letters better, which is why it's important to keep them in mind. But I'm sure I've missed things. So what I'd like you to do finally, before we meet, is to take that same piece of paper and write down a couple of other lenses, if you can think of any, that I may have missed. Other ways of looking at Paul that might help illuminate more things about him when we study his letters. So I think that's it, and I'm very thankful to you for sticking with me through these slides, and look forward to seeing you and talking about them. Thank you. Bye for now.